My name is Vinnie Bagwell, and I create art for public places. My process for research usually begins with wanting to know what matters the most. So, for instance, we're at the site of the enslaved Africans' rain garden. I began this project in 2009, and the big question at the time was, why should anybody care about the slaves? And so, of course, the first thing that I discovered was that we don't call them slaves. We call them enslaved Africans. These were people that were enslaved. And then, of course, the next big thing that I discovered was that Frederick Phillips the first was a major slave trader in the country, second to the folks in South Carolina, which I thought was a big deal. But what really made me squeal was when I discovered that John Jay, who at the time was a legislator, he was to become the first Supreme Court justice, he was the first guy who wrote a law to try to free enslaved Africans. It took him a couple of years, it took him a couple of tries, but ultimately he wrote a law for manumission, which was the beginning of emancipation in New York. And so a lot of times my process is intuitive. Just keep asking lots of questions, talking a lot to people, and listening to the things that they say. And then, of course, there's the voices in my head, that tell me stuff. And so things have a wonderful way of unfolding as they should. And I find that research begins with asking good questions. There are several ways that I get to do art for public places. One, of course, is to compete. I look for calls for art pretty much on the internet. I also am registered with major cities, so I get the emails. And I look for things that resonate with me, stories that are not well known, and particularly I like stories about marginalized people of color. So the second way is I can create things that I think are worthy, like, for instance, the enslaved Africans' rain garden, Ella Fitzgerald. I see the beginning of a story. I think that it's intriguing. I think I can do something that's powerful visually, and I think it's a story that people will appreciate. That's kind of how I weigh and measure what I want to focus on. So last summer of 2020, I'm just finishing Sojourner Truth for Poughkeepsie and Highland, New York, for the Walkway Over the Hudson. And an old friend, someone that I mentored in her youth, calls me up and announces that there's a burial ground in Montgomery, New York, where she lives. So I'm like, ooh, interesting. I want to see. So I ride up there, and it is really, really, I'm going to say spiritual. You get a sense of something there. The town of Montgomery wanted to do something to rehabilitate this space. So I made a proposal for a scope of services, and I said, here, this is what I see happening first, and it begins with conception and coming up with a good idea for context. And so they agreed, and so presently I'm in the process of developing 2 sculptures, and we're trying to figure out, how do you create a destination that will remain still pristine. You want to create something that's respectful, and you want to create something that everybody can appreciate. Now, you have to understand that Montgomery is like an hour and a half, almost 2 hours north of New York City. The culture there is very different. It is predominantly white. It is pretty much rural. So you're talking about a whole nother demographic relative to, I'll just say, New York City. And so again, in this time where we have racial divide and all kinds of things going on politically, to do a project like this, you have to do it with a certain measure of sensitivity. And the question is, what does that look like? So I'm in the process of researching and trying to decide what matters. The big challenge is that there's not a lot of documentation. This is a problem with African American history in general. A lot of our history and backstories are not documented on paper. You can't just Google. And so you have to kind of talk to historians, and you have to kind of literally go into people's homes and different kinds of things just to get the oral stories, because a lot of our stuff is oral. And so it's an interesting adventure. It's always interesting. Right now we are having our archaeologists decipher our ground penetrating survey. We had the United States Department of Agriculture do a GPR survey so we could figure out exactly where these people are interred, because we don't want to disturb them. Our goal is to preserve the space, but also to invite people to come to learn about this place, all in the name of humanity, giving these people back their humanity. Scale is one of those things that I learned about accidentally. Example, Ella Fitzgerald is life-size. She's like 5'7" in heels. And originally she was installed in front of 92 Main Street, which is known as the Trolley Barn, which is a large industrial building that has been converted into loft space now. And she got dwarfed by the building because the building's so tall, so huge, and she's so close to it that even though she's a life-size person, people kept complaining that they didn't know where she was. You couldn't see her. So we ended up moving across the street and giving her her own little alcove garden space. And again, it helped to humanize her, to give her her own air. So this is one of the reasons why it's important at the beginning of a public art project for the artist to literally go to the space, walk the space, see how people will approach the artwork, see how the artwork works relative to the surroundings, even landscaping and things like that. You want everything to be integrated. You want it to all look like it goes together. And to figure that out is kind of intuitive. It's about balance. It's about, for lack of a better word, cooperation between the artwork and the environment. I like the idea of putting the public in public art. From the very beginning of my practice, because I was making art for a public place, I wanted everybody's opinion. It was important to me to have consensus, important to me to know how people felt about what I was doing, the meaning of it, and just for clarity's sake, because the artwork belongs to the community, I think it's important that the surrounding community have a say before the artwork is finished. At least that's how I feel about it. So I started inviting people into my studio, workshops, previews, having big parties to let people come into my studio to see the artwork before it goes to casting, getting their feedback, learning how the artwork causes them to feel. That's the most important thing to me. It's not even so much that Vinnie is a genius, it's that the artwork speaks to people in sometimes unexpected ways. and it helps me to understand the value of what I do. There's a common thread that runs through every community. Um, Example, Yonkers is, I think, a relatively unique place to live because the administration is very engaging and very accessible. It's not unusual to come down to the river on a Friday in the summer and see half of City Hall sitting at the tables, having a beer, chilling, talking, shop or whatever. And you can walk over and have a conversation with the planning commissioner. Or, you can sit down and have a chat with, the person who's in charge of community development or whatever the case may be. So um, then you have community activists, movers and shakers in the community, people who make sure that things go right, make sure that the city does the right thing, whistleblowers. So in every community there are people who are involved with civic issues. The church is usually figuring largely, the schools, educators. And so whenever I go into a new public art project, I like meeting those people. I like meeting the mayor. I like meeting the planning commissioner. I like meeting the historian. I like meeting the clergy. I like meeting the people from the NAACP and the schools and everything, because these are the people that care about the quality of life in the community. And so the artwork is designed to enhance the quality of life. So again, you try to get a sense of what's important, what does that particular community value, and what does the artwork bring to the community. And so by hearing their voices, you get to understand the value of what you're doing. Otherwise, it's a shot in the dark. Now, some things are no-brainers, but some things matter more to some people that may not matter to others. So it's always good to check in with the community. It's respectful, and they always appreciate being engaged. So, and it's fun. I enjoy talking to the community and talking about the process and bringing them into my process. I think it helps people to value the final public artwork as well, because they get to see it become. The fun thing about this project is that it began in 2009 when the internet was still brand new. So Google was still relatively new. And, whereas before we had, the library and the Dewey Decimal System, now you can just kind of go into your computer, because we weren't really totally into our phones yet. That's another interesting phenomenon. And ask a question and see what comes up. And then, of course, lots of things come up, so you can just kind of click on them and see, what is that? And so my first decision was to make 5 people, because slavery is an epic story, and the question is, how many people do you need to try to cover the whole story? So you got 5 people: men, women, children, old people. Everybody was subject to being enslaved. I decided to name them, to humanize them. So Isati was the first sculpture that I made. Again, I wanted these people to be recognizable as African. Everybody knows that African women carry amazing things on their heads. This is a waterfront town, so I was like, okay, so I'll have her carrying a bucket of water and fish. And so now, because we're talking about the river, and again, this is a major transportation highway. This is how things got up and down New York State, going up the river. The question is, why not take the opportunity to talk about the Middle Passage on her? So again, researching the Middle Passage, what that process is like. You try to, again, inhabit their story. So you're imagining being stuck in the hull of a boat for a couple of months, and again, it's the whole idea of telling the story from a first-person perspective, as in, how would you feel, if you got ripped from your home? and had to live on a boat with a bunch of other people and not be able to walk around, go to the bathroom, relax. Again, this is a teachable moment for adults and children. And so the idea was to have just kind of touch points for people to kind of refer to just kind of prompt them to inquire about, well, the Middle Passage. Second sculpture, the boatman, Temba, the boatman. Again, named him. Temba is a Zulu name. It means faith, hope, trust. South Africa was the second stop after Guinea. And so the interesting thing about researching boatmen was that boatmen were the most highly prized enslaved Africans because these men knew how to navigate the water. We're talking about New York to West Africa, down to South Africa, around the corner up to Madagascar, then all the way around to Europe maybe, and then back across to New York, and not lose too much cargo. These people were not restricted. They were well cared for, well dressed. So now you have a boatman, a very interesting looking man. And again, I wanted to show the paradox of being him. So he works for a slave master during the day, but maybe by night he helps people escape on the river. So on his back there is a bas-relief of people escaping on the river. Braille. I use Braille for a couple of reasons. Number one, I spent grades 1 through 4 in a visually handicapped class because I am legally blind. And my classmate, there were only 6 of us in that class, my classmate in my grade, Susan Green, was blind, and I had to wait my turn, so I learned Braille while she was learning Braille. And I like the idea that, like language, there are different ways to communicate, and I like the idea that for some of us it just kind of looks interesting, like little bumps, kind of like scarification, but for somebody else they can run their fingers over it and they know what it says. I like that idea. Isati is 6 feet tall. That's tall for a woman, but that's still life size. Temba the boatman is 6'5", again tall for a man, but life size. The children are life size. Bibi is again a 6-foot woman, but that's life size. And then you have to take into consideration that they're going to be in this open space, and even though each of them has their own room, like all of this will be landscape, so they'll each have their own room. The idea is you don't want them to disappear because the scale and the openness of the space. And so whenever I'm designing something, I always try to remember that now, because, again, intuitively people look at something and in their minds make a decision about whether something's too big, too large, appropriate, inappropriate. And again, that's intuitive. I have to be mindful when I'm designing, because all of that matters. That's what makes it work. So for the enslaved African rain gardens, there are 5 people, 5 sculptures. And you'll notice these little white pads. Those are the foundations for where they're going to go. So for instance, this pad right here is number 1. That's for Bibi, the elder woman with the sun hat and the hoe. Then behind me over here, this is where Temba the boatman goes. Then over there, Isati will go right there where the benches and the trash receptacle is. And then way over there is where the children will go. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to dig a faux river that runs through all this. So we'll have to kind of block this off and construction will begin. So we're going to run a faux river through it. BCT Designs has done the architectural landscaping to make this a beautiful place, a reverent place. to remember the contributions of enslaved Africans.